In late April 2026, the American Capitol is focused on a single ballroom. Inside the Washington Hilton, the city's political and media elite have gathered for the White House Correspondents Dinner. Laughter and the clinking of glasses fill the room. At the head table, the president and vice president sit behind a security perimeter designed to be impenetrable. The threat closing in on the Hilton tonight has no political profile and no criminal record. It is an ordinary high school history teacher. A U.S. Senate investigation would later describe the night as a cascade of preventable failures. Local residents reported a suspicious individual near the side entrance minutes earlier, but because of a communication breakdown, the warning never reached the Secret Service agents inside. A figure in a stolen catering uniform walks past the final checkpoint with an unsettling calm. A white linen cloth on his serving tray conceals a cold, illegally modified semi-automatic handgun. This lapse in physical security was merely the final manifestation of a much deeper systemic breakdown that had been accelerating for years. Long before this night, the man we will call Mr. X was a pillar of his community. He was a dedicated history teacher who spent his own evenings and salary to help his students become informed citizens. The shift began in 2025. The new administration targeted federal education spending, eliminating $600 million in grants for teacher training and professional development. This diagram shows the fallout at the district level. The removal of a single grant collapsed the mentoring programs and support staff, forcing Mr. X to take on a double workload in subjects he wasn't trained to teach. Removing these foundational supports created a state of permanent professional exhaustion, the first layer of a profound personal collapse. The cuts soon reached the students. A $1 billion federal grant for school-based mental health counselors was revoked, leaving rural districts with no specialized support for at-risk youth. Meanwhile, aggressive immigration crackdowns decimated the local population. The teacher pipeline from abroad dried up, and several of Mr. X's students simply vanished, their families too terrified to leave their homes. These policy choices had immediate, local consequences. One of Mr. X's bright, struggling students took his own life after the school's counselor was laid off. Mr. X was the one who identified the body. The state had systematically dismantled the specific safety nets that kept those children alive. Mr. X's own survival depended on the Public Service Loans Forgiveness Program. For years, he had operated under a simple promise: 10 years of public service in exchange for debt relief. In late 2025, the Trump administration finalized a rule change that blocked thousands of public workers from that promised relief. Mr. X opened a letter from his provider to find $40,000 in debt reinstated, with no path to repayment. That same week, he watched local politicians pitch the president's new plan to solve school violence by arming teachers with handguns. When a government breaks its fundamental economic promises to its citizens, it leaves them in a state of hopeless, cornered desperation. This schematic explains the micro-level failure at the Hilton. Local perimeter security and inside Secret Service agents operated on entirely non-overlapping radio frequencies. A warning about a suspicious person in a catering uniform was broadcast locally, but it never bridged into the federal network. The breakdown in communication was absolute and total. Mr. X walked through the inner perimeter because the system meant to stop him was already fragmented and hollowed out. Inside the main ballroom, Mr. X emerged from a service corridor. He was now 40 yards from the president and vice president. He raised the weapon, driven by a conclusion he had reached over months of isolation: that voting, protesting, and the democratic tools he once taught were all broken. A gunshot cracked through the room. Tables overturned and guests scrambled for the exits as Secret Service agents formed a human shield. A sharpshooter returned fire, striking him in the shoulder and spinning him to the marble floor. That single shot was the inevitable intersection of an ignored, desperate citizen and the highest concentration of political power in the country. The politicians were rushed away unharmed. A wounded agent was saved by his vest. A high school teacher lay bleeding on the floor, his life over. Security experts will spend months deconstructing the radio failure and the perimeter breach. The difficult autopsy involves the transformation of a lifelong protector of children into a lethal threat. National instability is not always caused by external enemies. Often, it is systematically manufactured through the deliberate dismantling of a nation's own social infrastructure. Inside a sterile federal interrogation room sits a man the world knows only as the teacher. It is 3 days after the shot that nearly killed a president, and he is entirely motionless. He refuses to look at the FBI agents or speak to his court-appointed lawyer. The physical world barely registers for him anymore. He is trapped in the mental echo of a single trigger pull. To understand how a dedicated public servant ends up in that chair, investigators had to retrace his steps. They had to follow the path from a hopeful university lecture hall to the psychological breaking point of a shattered soul. Years earlier, on his graduation day, Mr. X was a picture of optimism. Those who knew him described a borderline genius who actively chose education over the high-paying corporate careers his intelligence could have easily secured. He believed teaching was a sacred profession. That belief held until the start of the second Trump term. The administration immediately implemented broad policy reversals that targeted the foundational support of the public education system. A profession relies on the faith it instills in its followers. When the state actively breaks the social contract with its citizens, the structural integrity of that faith begins to fail. FBI investigators mapped his radicalization by looking at specific policies that hit his life, starting with sudden changes to the public service loan forgiveness program. A new rule allowed the Department of Education to deny his $80,000 debt forgiveness by citing a vague clause regarding a substantial illegal purpose. On a teacher's salary, that debt became a mountain he could never hope to climb. The pressure increased when the administration canceled $1 billion in children's mental health services, claiming these programs no longer served federal interests. The fallout landed directly in Mr. X's classroom. His school's only counselor walked out the door, leaving children with severe trauma to fend for themselves. He started buying food and juice out of his own pocket just to give students a reason to talk to him, acting as a completely unlicensed therapist because there was no one else left. By systematically defunding basic care, the government turned public schools into triage centers. Teachers were forced to absorb the weight of systemic neglect until they began to drown under the burden. His moral compass fractured further, as nearly $1 trillion in proposed Medicaid cuts froze the funding essential for his disabled students. He watched a child with muscular dystrophy regress, trapped in a failing body, because the state-promised wheelchair never arrived. The final pillars of his school community crumbled when an immigration crackdown imposed a $100,000 fee on H-1B visas. This policy forced Mr. X's closest colleague, a brilliant science teacher, to leave the country. The children at the school normalized this fear, playing make-believe ice raids during recess. For them, the terror of state intervention had become a common playground game. The state had moved beyond passivity. By targeting the most helpless populations, it created an environment of institutional cruelty that pushed its most dedicated public servants toward the edge. Event in Butler, Pennsylvania. A simple service entrance had been left entirely unguarded. This shows the result of a Department of Government efficiency drive. Budget cuts consolidated separate security sectors, creating massive confusion over gate responsibility. This chaos created an exact 8-minute gap at the side gate, the opening Mr. X walked through. The same austerity policies that stripped away his students' support systems had simultaneously eroded the security infrastructure meant to protect the president. When the state trades public safety and social stability for budget cuts, it creates both the motive and the opportunity for its own destruction. Back in the interrogation room, the FBI agent questioned the logic of throwing away a life for a missed shot. Mr. X responded that he felt no consequence for himself, not when he saw the faces of 4,000 children the system had already abandoned. His objective was to force the country to look at its own reflection. He wanted to trigger a conversation that would last longer than a single news cycle. You cannot starve a school's soul without producing ghosts. He intended his shot to be a permanent, failing grade for a society that stopped caring. As the judge read out the sentence of life without parole, the media cameras panned across the gallery, lingering on a weeping woman, the mother of one of his former special education students. The government responded quickly to fix the physical security fences, yet it remained blind to the $12 billion it had slashed from public education. In his empty classroom, a child's drawing hangs on the wall, calling the teacher a hero. On the whiteboard, his final lesson defines the duty of a citizen. When public service is treated as an ideological enemy, the system fails the human being. The teacher wanted to show America a lesson, but the question remains whether the nation is willing to learn it.